This story happened a long time ago when the fear of witchcraft dominated everyone. The accusation of practicing witchcraft was one of the most serious charges that a person could be accused of, especially since it might expose him to death. That is why people were careful about their actions and not to do anything mysterious, and they make sure to visit the church every week. It was a remote town. The houses were simple and the fields were extensive. The roads were dirt and everyone worked to earn a living. There are those who work in agriculture, others who raise cows, and others who raise chickens, a society that lives on what it produces. Throughout the week, everyone is busy with his work, and on Sunday after the Mass in the church, they go to the town market, which is held every Sunday, so that everyone can buy what they need. This day was special and could not be missed by any of the residents in the town. In the middle of this agricultural town, there was Mr. Davis, who lived in a small house at the end of the dirt road. Mr. Davis was quiet. He did not talk much, and the people in the town did not know much information about him. He did not work in agriculture or anything else. He was a mystery to many. Even his neighbor Colleen did not know anything about him. He was careful not to let anyone enter his house, and he neglected going to church, but he made sure to go to the market. The people of the town used to gather on holidays and occasions to all celebrate the country music that everyone loves. But as usual, Mr. Davis does not attend or participate with the others in any activity. His neighbor Colleen remembers that when her husband died, everyone came to the church to participate in the mourning ceremonies, and then they went to her house to offer help. But she never saw Mr. Davis. He didn't even try to talk to her. Mr. Davis's calm and introverted behavior made everyone respect his isolation and leave him undisturbed, even though they were curious about what he was doing. He is always at home except during market times, and he always closed to himself and does not share anything about him with anyone. Even the villagers never once saw any of Mr. Davis's relatives and did not know whether he had a family or not. It was strange for the community surrounding Mr. Davis, which made the gossip around him increase. One day, Mr. Davis went to the market, and there was a young man with him who was thin and looked pale. Everyone was surprised. This was the first time they had seen Mr. Davis with anyone else. And who was this strange person? No one in the town had seen this young man before. He looked different from all the townspeople in his appearance and clothes. From that day on, the people of the village began to see Mr. Davis with this young man, and they knew that he had already moved to live with him in his house. Mr. Davis and the young man. He looked different from all the townspeople in his appearance and clothes. From that day on, the people of the village began to see Mr. Davis with this young man, and they knew that he had already moved to live with him in his house, and he used to go out with him for a walk every now and then. Everyone was watching them talking. They were strange, especially because they used to walk early in the morning before the people woke up, or plus 63, late at night after most of the villagers sleep. Some interpreted the presence of this young man with Mr. Davis because he was his servant. Others confirmed that this young man might be a student of Mr. Davis, but to this day no one knows the relationship between Davis is this young man. After a while, Mr. Davis and this mysterious young man began to climb to the top of the hill. This happened on a full moon night. The place in that area was scary. It was full of ancient stones and rocks, and Mr. Davis and the young man spent the night in that area. The visits were repeated every month to the point that the townspeople noticed what Mr. Davis and the young man were doing, and many linked their rise on a full moon night to the possibility of practicing magic and sorcery, because those nights are known to have powers and sorcerers often exploit them to practice magic. The townspeople watched Mr. Davis and the young man, and one day one of the townspeople stopped them and asked Mr. Davis kindly, "Why do you go to this dark and lonely place in the middle of the night?" Mr. Davis smiled and said to him, "I love old places. They remind me of the past. The air is also beautiful on summer nights, and by the moonlight I can see the entire countryside." Mr. Davis continued talking about the beauty of those atmospheres and nights, until the man said to him, "Well, I can try the same thing with you." The man was afraid, but he was curious and wanted to know if Mr. Davis was right or if he was making it up in order to evade answering his question. Before Mr. Davis could respond to the man, the mysterious young man interrupted him and said rudely to the man, "We don't want other people near us. We just want to talk to each other." Mr. Davis seemed annoyed by the rudeness with which he spoke to the man and wanted to tone down what he had just said. He said to the man, "Well, the place there may seem lonely at first glance, especially since there are rumors confirming that area has many soldiers buried." The man replied, "Yes, this is true. I've heard that farmers find bones and sometimes old pots while working in the fields up on the hill, Mr. Davis continued. The man replied, "Indeed, many have found these things." Mr. Davis seemed excited and said to him, "I would like to know more about these things, because I would like to know more about these people and the lives they lived and the gods they worshipped." Fear appeared on the man's features, and he lowered his voice, saying, "I think they may have practiced magic." Mr. Davis laughed and continued the conversation with the man, who began telling many stories that seemed mythical. He confirmed that his father was telling him about a magician who lived a long time ago on the hill. He was wearing strange clothes, and many people heard him speaking in a strange language. Some even saw him speaking to the air. It was as if he was talking to someone in front of him. Mr. Davis listened carefully to what the man said, and suddenly he asked for permission to return to his house, with a promise they would continue this conversation at another time. The man felt embarrassed, as if he had said something he wasn't supposed to say, and more days passed, and Mr. Davis's habit continued as it was, going out on moonlit nights, going up the hill and spending the whole night. A few miles away, in one of the small towns near to Mr. Davis's, it was rumored that there was a girl possessed by the devil, and she began to suffer from strange seizures. These seizures made her scream and throw things in the room, and even made her make strange noises and crawl on the floor. After a short time, she regained consciousness. Once again, she does not remember any of what happened. At that time, epilepsy was not a recognized disease, especially in simple rural areas. It was rumored that all these symptoms meant that this person had been possessed by the devil after being exposed to magic. This strange case of the little girl created a state of terror in her town and in all the neighboring countries, including the town of Mr. Davis, whose behavior has recently become more introverted and thus more arousing the curiosity of the people in the town. One morning in September, a very terrible thing happened. A farmer was heading to work on a nearby farm, and the atmosphere was still dark. Then he passed by the hill. He saw something that looked like a human body. When he approached closer, he found someone hanged on a tree, the tree at the top of the hill. The farmer felt very afraid and returned again to tell people what he saw. As soon as the farmers heard him, many went up with him to the top of the hill, and indeed they found that there was someone who had been hanged on the tree, and under the foot of it there was a knife covered in blood. It was strange because the young man was not bleeding from anywhere, and the cause of his death was hanging. One of these farmers approached the body and shouted in a loud voice, "It is the young man who lives with Mr. Davis." And then all the men on the hill suspected that the killer was Mr. Davis himself. So they sent one of the children to Mr. Davis's house to make sure he was there, because he was the only suspect and would most likely be the killer. As for the men remaining on the hill, they lowered the young man after cutting the rope around his neck. When they lowered him to the ground, they discovered that his clothes were completely black, like the clothes that priests in ancient times used to wear. One of the men went to his nearby house to get his horse to carry the body on it, but as soon as the horse approached the tree, it screamed and tried to run away. However, the men gathered around it and were able to catch it and put the body on its back to take it back to the town. The horse seemed terrified and in a state of agitation. The men walked alongside the horse, trying to calm it down until they reached the town. When the men arrived in the town, they found the little boy whom they had previously sent to Mr. Davis's house. The child was standing in the middle of the road, looking pale and like a white sheet of paper from intense fear, and the women of the town gathered around him, trying to understand from him what had happened. As soon as the horse saw the child, he neighed loudly. He rose and moved violently until the young man's body fell from his back, and then he turned and started running down the road. They say that a horse can smell blood, so it ran away as soon as it approached Mr. Davis's house. The men tried to carry the body from the floor and headed to Mr. Davis's house. The men knocked on the door several times, and when Mr. Davis did not respond, they forced the door open. When they entered the house, they found a terrifying sight. Mr. Davis was lying on the table, and there was a black tape tied to his eyes while his hands were tied behind his back. Mr. Davis's chest was cut from below the neck to the abdomen, and his heart was taken out. The scene was terrible, and as soon as the men saw Mr. Davis's appearance, they rushed outside. Everyone was terrified. Some of the men even vomited. Because of the severity of what they saw in Mr. Davis's house, this was the first time that the townspeople entered Mr. Davis's house, which looked very depressing and smelled like death. The people of the town decided that day to put both bodies in the house together, until they knew what they would do with them. When they went to the priest in the church, he confirmed that the bodies should be buried, but the people of the town objected to burying the bodies in the cemeteries near the town, which are located behind the church. This is because both did not believe in God and did not go to church. It seems that both of them practiced magic and believed in unnatural things. Some brave people entered Mr. Davis's house and carried the bodies, which were wrapped in black cloths, and went outside the town to bury the bodies. While they were there to collect the bodies, one of the young men from the town noticed a green bottle that he knew contained sleeping medicine. He said that he believed that what had happened was... The young man gave this medicine to Mr. Davis, and as soon as he fell asleep, he killed him in this horrific way and tore his heart out of his chest in order to use his heart in magic. The townspeople were satisfied with this explanation and continued on their way to bury the bodies. There, at a long distance from the town, they dug a large hole and threw the bodies into it and stoned them. The strange thing was that several days later, while some of the townspeople were passing by their grave, they found a large pool of blood, and on top of it were many flies, big black flies. They felt afraid and moved away from the place immediately, and although a long time had passed since that incident, the horses couldn't pass through this particular area, especially since the pool of blood was appearing every now and then. The townspeople approached the priest to ask him how to deal with the matter. He advised them to wash the blood from that pond. Indeed, the people of the town washed the blood from that area, and then the flies flew, forming a large black cloud that headed towards Mr. Davis's house. Here, the villagers decided that no one would live in this house and that they would burn it, so that the magic that Mr. Davis and the other young man practiced in it would not affect them. Although the house burned to the ground, Mr. Davis's memory lived on people's minds, especially since many of the townspeople confirmed that they saw Mr. Davis and the mysterious young man after their death walking together towards the hill, and this often happened on a full moon night. After more than 20 years, large parts of the town were sold to a major merchant named Sir Anderson, who wanted to build a large palace in order for him and his family to get away from the noise of the city. At that time, the number of the original inhabitants of the town had declined significantly, but some of them still remained. They remembers the story of Mr. Davis. When construction work began, they tried to prevent the workers and warn the landowner, but he faced everything they told him with sarcasm. The construction work was completed, and the house was one of the largest houses in the town and neighboring countries. Despite the beauty of its design, it frightened everyone who passed by it. Less than a month after the arrival of Sir Anderson's family, misfortunes began to pile up on his head. His works were exposed to many successive thefts, and when he tried to fix the matter, his stores were mysteriously burned. As for his family, his mother died within the first 6 months after they lived in the house, and after 8 months, Anderson found his daughter in her room having hanged herself. This happened on the night of the full moon of the month September. The townspeople say that it is the same night that Mr. Davis was killed. Since that night, fat black flies have gathered around the house and have formed an annoying black cloud as if blocking the light from the house. It was difficult for everyone in the house, and no one was able to approach the house. Even the servants who had worked for Sir Anderson for years decided without any preliminaries to leave their work and leave the town, which made him search among the people of the town for someone to work in his house. But most of the people clearly refused and expressed their fear of what might happen to them in this house. Sir Anderson tried more than once to employ people to help the family at home, but every time he failed. Many of the people who accepted to work for the family confirmed that they could see an old man and a young man standing together in the various rooms of the house. It was terrifying. An old man and a young man standing together in the various rooms of the house. It was terrifying. On the same night of Sir Anderson's son's death, his daughter found him in his room, and he had hanged himself. The whole family felt terrified and were sure that there was something strange in the house. The villagers remember that night and the following day clearly, especially since Sir Anderson's family left the house in a hurry. They did not even collect their belongings and left them in the house. From that day on, the house became a destination for thieves who used to enter and steal furniture, clothes, and even decorative pieces. When the house was empty and only unworthy things remained in it, the thieves did not return again, but instead of them, many people who wore black and were clearly from outside the town visited it. The flies were increasingly hovering over the Anderson family's house, but they increased strangely during the lunar nights. The following year, in September, despite the calm of the night, the entire town heard a terrible screaming sound coming from the Anderson family's house. The sound was terrifying, and no one dared to approach it. But early in the morning, the men of the village gathered and decided to go together to the house to find out what was happening inside. One of the men suggested closing the doors and windows of the house from the inside with wood and nails in order to prevent any intruder from entering. Everyone went to Anderson's house, and when they arrived, the house looked very sad, more than usual, and then the men decided to break into the house all at the same time. When they entered the house, they found what none of them had imagined. There was a large six-pointed star drawn on the ground, surrounded by melted black wax, and in the middle of the star, there was a girl stripped of her clothes. Her body was cut off from the chest, and her heart was removed. They immediately knew that the house had been used to practice magic again. Everyone was terrified and decided to bury the girl after the priest came to the house. They tried to contact with the Andersons, but unfortunately days passed, and everyone failed to communicate with Sir Anderson's family, the owners of the house. So the men of the town decided to burn the house, and they actually set fire to the house, and only then was it gone. The fat black flies did not return again. Sir Anderson's family did not return to the town and did not claim the house or the land, so the burned house remained in its place, and no one dared to enter it or live in it again.